Thanks for being here. This morning, as you know, we're going to continue through the Old Testament, but let's start with a prayer. Let's pray. Father in heaven, as always, we're so thankful that we can be together as a body. Lord, we're thankful that somehow, somewhere in our life, either an individual or individuals or just circumstances brought us to know your Son, Jesus Christ, and we're so thankful. Father, help us to remember the gift that we've been given and help to share it with others. We thank you for your word. We thank you that every time we look in your word, we see something new that we think you may want for us to understand and to live. And we hope we do that today as well as we study the prophet Elijah. So be with us, God. Bless us. We ask a special prayer for Grace Kagi, who's in the hospital right now. She's got some complications from some surgery. We just pray that you would be of the doctors as they try to determine what it is exactly she's had the reaction to. But bless her and bless Mark and Richard and the whole family. It's been a struggle of late, so continue to strengthen them and give them faith as well. Through all this, may your name be blessed. Amen. Okay. Here's the requirements. Yeah, wrong slide. Wrong slide. Going forward. Not going back. Let's get there. Can you back me up to number 1? Reverse isn't working. My reverse gear is broken. Anyway, as we go through this litany of the Old Testament people, we did for the second half of the class, so this is really 2022. You didn't know it because this is supposed to be taught in 2022. We've done Solomon. We were going to do Elijah last week. Mark had to change his schedule, so we moved into Isaiah. So we moved a little bit down the timeline. Now we're coming back a little bit with Elijah this morning. So I'm going to see if that helped. Yeah. We took that big chart that we always try to reference, and I just took a piece of it and blew it up so we could see it. But what we didn't talk about last week in any detail, and we don't necessarily need to because it's kind of common knowledge, but the kingdom split. And it split because of Rehoboam and Jeroboam. God actually talks about taking the kingdom away from David's descendants and giving it to Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fiddled it away because he didn't do very good either. And as you look down through the list of kings, we find out that both Jeroboam and Rehoboam were lousy kings. And then what you'll see is we continue down that path and brings us up to wicked King Ahab, and that's where Elijah steps in. But that's kind of the separation there where after Solomon the kingdom splits. So now when you hear people talk about Israel, that's the northern kingdom of 10 tribes. When you hear people talk about Judah, that's the southern kingdom. So you see that and you think they're intermixed, and they're really not. There really is a difference. It's capital of Samaria, capital of Israel, Samaria, and Judah is Jerusalem. So just keep that in mind as far as the time frame and what's going on. And what's going on is the best way to put it, God's chosen people don't realize the blessings they have. God's chosen people don't realize that God has chosen them to represent him and has an expectation of them to be godly people and continues to be patient with them and continues to bless them. They don't get it, and then they're not so blessed, and they wake up a little bit, and then they come back. But it's a cycle that we don't understand. And I think the reason we don't understand it because I think we're in it ourselves. And if we think we're not, then we need to just do some self-assessment because I think we still lose sight of the fact of how blessed we are in some of the things we do and the way we act and things like that. One more shot. There was a time when we had equipment that would forward when you throw it to forward. Bruce, it's not moving. Bruce? Oh, Bruce. There we go. So just real quick, Mark referenced this last week. He's got this list, and we were going to get a printout, and we'll get that soon. Yes. And it's a summary of all the kings of both Israel and of Judah. And it basically says were they good or were they bad or whatever. So if you look at this listing right here, and I've got to look backwards because that's too small in the back. As I said, for Israel, start out with Jeroboam, and then Nadab, and then Baasha, and then Allah, and then Zimri, and then Omri, and then Ahab is where we are now. And if you look at how the northern kingdom is doing, the scorecard there is not good. Looks a lot like Monty's report card in high school. Oh, those would be like C's maybe. But anyway, evil, 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 evil. So the kingdom, the northern kingdom is doing really, really bad. And the southern kingdom, to be honest, first couple kings there weren't so good themselves either. So, like I say, as we're trying to draw what's going on in the Old Testament, here's what we're seeing. We're just seeing not a very good progression of God's people. All right, there we go. So, today is Elijah. And as I always like to do, most of these men we've studied have a following of certain things that we remember about them based on whether it was through Bible class or through later studies in classes that we experienced. So I always ask, what's your main thought? What comes to mind first and foremost when you think of the name Elijah? Not Elisha, but Elijah. He came first. Please?
Chariots of fire.
Chariots of fire, which was, what was that? What was that event? End of his life, he was carried away, right? In the presence of Elisha, right? And that's the one at the bottom, right? Bottom right. So hopefully you didn't cheat and look at that and come up with that. What else?
The standoff with the prophets of Baal and the fire and the water and all of that.
That's the one that I always think of. When I think of Elijah, I think of that just amazing story about him going up against the 450 prophets of Baal. And the complete and utter job that was done there. And there's a lot of history there as far as why that spot was chosen and why that particular method was chosen, on and on and on. What else? There's a lot more that he did. There's a lot more interesting things that happened in the life of Elijah.
I'm cheating, but I see he's being fed by the ravens up there.
That's okay. That's why I put it up there. So yeah, the story starts like this. Out of nowhere, Ahab is in charge. Things are not good. Jezebel is really in charge. Israel's a mess. The false prophets and the worship of the false prophets is out of control. And out of nowhere, this guy by the name of Elisha the Tishbite shows up. And what's he say? He goes right to Ahab, which is a pretty bold move, right? He goes to Ahab and he says, what? It's going to be a drought. There's going to be a long drought. It basically says 3 years, but if you look at the chronology, it's more like 3.5 years. And then what happens? He disappears, right? He goes to this Transjordan area, which is very, very remote, and to Bill's point, he is there fed by God's care, because God told him to go there. Okay, there's a reason I bring that up. God tells him to go there, and he's cared for by God. He gets 2 meals a day, better than the Israelites did. They got 1 meal a day. Right? So that's that slide. And then we've already talked about the sacrifice of the prophets of Baal, which was nothing other than a comedy show. And then God's action. And then what about lower left? That's a lot of the story today is the lower left. What happened after the big standoff? They tore up the high place of worship, because basically, if you remember that story, not only did it lick up the sacrifice, it licked up the water, it licked up the stones, it melted the stones, everything was gone, because if you remember, part of the deal was high places in Israel were not favorable to God. So the whole area was taken out. So hey, the battle's won, the prophets are gone because they basically went out and killed the prophets. So everybody lives happily ever after, right? Yeah. So he goes forth to where Jezebel is with Ahab as the rain starts, and then Ahab tells Jezebel what happened, and then Jezebel says, hey, you think it's been bad before? Because part of this idol worship was not just that, but they were killing God's prophets. They were slaying God's prophets, which is another part of today's message. We get to it. This is when he leaves without God's direction, and he goes off and he says, I just want to die. You know, he didn't stop to think about what just happened. He didn't stop to think about the great victory. He's either pouting or he's scared, or a combination of both. But off he goes into this wilderness area, not via God's direction. And then the angel comes and wakes him up, and there's food prepared for him. So that's the story there. So, okay. Anything else before we get started? Anybody remember anything else that was unique about Elijah, something he did or something that happened with him? Okay. If I can get this to work. Okay. So what do we know about Elijah? Pretty bold, right? Why was he bold? Confronted Ahab here. Confronted Ahab later. Confronts Baal's prophets. As we would say, puts a good old-time whipping on Baal's prophets, but that was really God at work, showing the power of God in an area where Israel's God would have been powerless in this area, because this area was the stronghold of Baal, the Baal worshipers, okay? So he's a very bold guy, not hesitant to get in their face and say, this is what God said, this is not good. He was a miracle worker. It's one thing I thought somebody might say something about. What miracle did he perform?
Oil with the widow.
Please?
The jar of oil.
Jar of oil, that's one.
Didn't he raise the widow's son?
Raised the widow's son, yeah. So there's some action there. So, Tim, did you have one?
He prayed it would rain and it did. Oh, that counts as him doing the miracle.
Right, well, he was God's messenger, so indirectly, yes. Don?
And he outran the chariot
Yeah.
of Ahab.
Yeah, he got there before Ahab did, which is pretty amazing. All right, kept his word. There's numerous occasions of that, but the one that I thought had in mind here is who comes along a little bit later in this story as Ahab and Elijah meet. Because remember now, Elijah, before he runs away, he's hiding out in this Transjordan area, and then he comes to meet with Ahab. He's going to lay down the challenge. Ahab and someone else are out looking for watered lands, anything that could be saved because of the drought that's going on. Remember that prophet's name? Obadiah. Close. So Obadiah, but we'll get to that. But he tells Obadiah something, and he holds to it. So he's a man of his word, keeps his word, and he doesn't get real caught up in himself. If you think about that, he goes through all this stuff. But then all of a sudden, there's this side of Elijah that comes out, which is a little interesting, and that's one of the things we want to talk about today. The comment is repeated through here. It says, if you look at that, and I, even I only. Does anybody know what that's reference to?
He was the only prophet of God left.
Exactly. Yeah.
Obadiah had said he had hid other prophets in a cave.
Yeah. Very good. So we're going to talk about that too as we go through this. And then later on, he kind of, after this big event, he kind of disappears for a while. And you see other prophets come out. Some are unnamed. Some's Micaiah. When they talk about going out to war, he's the one that says, hey, go ahead and go out to war. You'll win. And Ahab says, I know you're lying to me. So it is, So, but then he comes back on the scene. He comes back on the scene one more time to talk to Ahab about something. Remember what that was? He condemns him for something that he did, that Jezebel set up. Naboth's vineyard, right? Naboth's vineyard. So Ahab really wanted it. And Naboth said, look, far be it from me to sell my inheritance, because that was huge in that culture. The land was given to them by God, and it really wasn't a fickle thing where you could just move it around. It was not part of the Jewish law. But they set it up, Jezebel sets it up so that he's falsely accused, Naboth is falsely accused. They kill him. Jezebel says, hey, go get your vineyard. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, God calls Elijah to come back in. Hey, go talk to this guy because you need to let him know what just happened and how it's not good. And then his son, after Ahab dies, the next person on the throne is Ahaziah, who was Ahab's son. And what happens with Ahaziah that kind of pulls Elijah out of retirement, so to speak? He falls and he's really sick. And he tells his guys to go out and find some of the prophets of Baal to tell me how I'm going to do. Not pleasing to God. God says, we probably need to correct this situation and calibrate it once more. And he goes and he sends Elijah once again and says, is there not a prophet in your land of God that can tell you what's going on? Therefore, you're going to die. So, it's interesting because what happens is, when it first happens, his men go out and they run into Elijah, and Elijah tells them. So they come back and they describe this person to Ahaziah. And you know what he says? He goes, ooh, that's Elijah the Tishbite. Yikes. So he says, take 50 guys out and get him and bring him back here. Well, they send the 50 guys out, and what happens? God destroys them with fire. Nobody comes back. So they send 50 more. So 50 more guys go out. Destroys them with fire. Third party goes out, and the guy's really smart. He goes up and he says, please don't kill me. I'm just here to deliver this message. Please don't take my men, they're innocent, and everything else. And then Elijah goes back with him, but nothing changes. He's still going to die. So it's just another example of God's power over all this. This is not the only time that people have tried to track down prophets and do them harm. Okay. So all that being said, let's get started. I'm going to have to apologize. I did not bring my glasses, so my reading might be a little slower than usual. But let me set the stage here, I guess. When Elijah shows up on the scene and tells Ahab there's going to be a drought. Like we said, he goes off to this area that's quite remote. He's fed by the ravens, and everything's going okay there. But all of a sudden, what happens? The stream where he is dries up. So he's told to go on. So let's just look at some key scriptures. Start over there. We'll go over to 1 Kings chapter 17. He delivers the message, and in verse 5, God had told him what to do. He said, so he did. So he went, and it did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith that is on the east of the Jordan. And it says there in verse 7, and after a while, the brook dried up. So he had to move on. So then in verse 14, it says, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. So he meets the widow. When he gets over to this new area, he says, hey, can you give me a drink? And she does. He said, can you fix me a morsel of bread? She goes, well, I can't, because I'm gathering sticks for this last mite of food I have. I'm going to feed my son, and what? And we're going to die. So the drought is pretty severe. So this is a crisis situation all the way over to this land now as well. And Elijah walks into this, and that's what he finds, but he basically makes this woman a promise. He's going to take care of her. And then right in the midst of this story, her son dies after everything's okay. And she says, did you come here to reveal my sin to God, to take my son? And Elijah prays to God, and he says, why have you done this? So that's when Elijah goes ahead, and he restores his son's life. So we don't necessarily know why some of these things happen, but they're all there for our learning, and we just kind of have to take that and try to figure out what is most important in the message there. I think the most important thing is, at this time, Elijah's doing exactly what he's told to do. And even when he confronts something like this, he didn't understand why God took the child, but he did act accordingly and restored the child. So this is the good one here. Verse 18, go to chapter 18. This is where he meets Obadiah. So let's see, somebody mentioned what Obadiah had done. Was that you? Oh, that was Bill. Okay. So keep in mind, the story's about Elijah, right? And then what happens here is the crisis is really bad. And what happens is Ahab says, hey, Obadiah, who is basically Ahab's right-hand man. Ahab a good guy or a bad guy? Bad guy, right? Obadiah good guy or bad guy? But he's working with a bad guy. But he believes in the Lord, okay? He believes in the Lord so much that he's willing to risk his life. He's gone out and stored 100 prophets because he knew of Jezebel's edict to slay all of the prophets. So here's Obadiah working behind the scenes, working this stuff out. And the reason I bring that up is this, even I only, right? You got to keep an eye on what Elijah's thinking, but what's going on around him. So Obadiah's out looking for any animal he can find, any water he can find, any green pasture he can find, so they can salvage what they can in the midst of this crisis. He encounters Elijah. Elijah says, go tell Ahab, I'm here to talk. He says, that's not how I operate. I'm not like you. I don't have the courage to just get in somebody's face and say, here's what's going on. He says, he'll kill me. I'll tell him you're here. We'll come to find you, and the Lord will have lifted you up and taken you we know not where. He says, And he says, and this is about him being a man of his word. He said, you do it, I'll be here. So Obadiah does it. He acts according to what the Lord has asked him to do. So we won't spend a lot of time there. I just want to say, in verse 13 there in chapter 18, Obadiah says, has it not been told my Lord what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, how I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water? Pleading his case that I really don't want to do this, it's because of my sin you're asking me to do this. Don't you know that I'm a man of God? I've done these things. So we've got two characters here now, and now we're introducing some more characters, and that's the 50 prophets, actually the 100 prophets hid by 50s in the cave being taken care of. Here's a crisis. People haven't eaten. The land's a mess. Jezebel's killing everybody in sight that has anything to do with God. And we've got these three camps, I'll say. One camp is Elijah, powerful man of God, speaking the truth. One camp is Obadiah, working in the background, saving prophets. And here, this third camp that we see right now is the 100 prophets. So we got a crisis. We have three groups of people or person that are God's people, and they're all doing what? They're all reacting differently to the crisis. Is that safe to say? These are all godly people, but they're all doing things differently. So in times of crisis and in times of turmoil, have you ever, you're involved, you're in the middle of it, and you say, boy, I wish I had the faith of Steve. I just see how Steve handles this. I'm not doing it as well. He's more faithful or he's more spiritual. Or I say, this other person, more faithful, more spiritual. I wish I had that. Or worse yet, and this is one of the things I think Kevin seems to slip into every message, this word of self-righteous. Maybe your reaction is, why? Why is Wayne not reacting like I am? I've got the answer. I know what I'm doing. I'm the one that is really, and that's Elijah, right? I'm the only guy around that's doing anything. I'm the only guy here that's making a fuss. I'm the only guy that's trying to point this out. I'm out beating the bushes. I'm out spreading the word. I'm out challenging Baal. I'm in Ahab's face. So we need to be cautious of how we respond in crisis. And we've been through some of late. So it's so easy to either cower and say, I don't have the spirituality or the faithfulness to act like that person, which is not good because we're seeing here that people are reacting differently to this crisis and they're all godly people. Or maybe we take the attitude that I don't know why everybody's not falling in line like me. So there's the issue. And like I said, Kevin, I appreciate every time I hear you use the word self-righteous in a message, I look right here real quick and I think, what do we do to keep from being that way? And I think this is one of the messages that are tight. So like I said, Ahab in the face. I'm not Ahab. Elijah's, strong and bold. Obadiah's working in the background to save people. What are the 100 prophets doing? What are the 100 prophets doing? They're BGing. Staying alive, staying alive. That's going to be lost a lot on this crowd, but they're staying alive. They're staying alive. Why are they staying alive? The more people that get taken out, the less chance we're going to get this revival going, right? So you've got these 100 people that you may think are carrying in this cave, but that's not the impression you get. Why would Obadiah risk his life to keep these guys alive, right? Comment? No, thought the hand went up. So there's kind of a strong message here. We need to be sensitive how we react, and we certainly need to be more sensitive to how others react. We are not to judge. I mean, and I think this is a really good case of, makes no sense to me. I think of those 100 in the cave, they're cowards. They should be out doing something. Obadiah should be in Ahab's face. He shouldn't be hiding behind and doing this stuff behind his back. But that's the way God's working this right now. And it gets even more important here in a minute. So, we won't spend any time on the big event, because the big event is what we do well in knowing, where the prophets of Baal are challenged. The interesting thing is when he went to Ahab, what's the first thing Ahab said to him? Anybody remember that? He finally confronts Ahab after telling him about the rain. This is when he comes back for the challenge of the prophets. Ahab says, "Oh, there you are, O troubler of Israel." Just like any good politician, you create a disaster and you find someone to blame it on. So that's exactly what he's doing here. He takes what Ahab has just destroyed his country. He's got this false worship. He's got all this stuff going on. And he looks at the man of God, Elijah, and says, "Oh, there you are, O troubler of Israel." Well, Elijah's not one to hold back, so he straightens him out as, "Well, no, that's not really the case, is it?" And he goes through that. So like I said, we won't spend a lot of time there, but what we will do, if I can find this here. The 450 prophets are there. There we go. The battle is pretty much complete as far as they can do nothing. And like I said, this is in the stronghold of Baal. And Baal was supposed to be the god that controlled the rain and controlled the harvest. He was the god of fertility and all these things, right? But he had to occasionally bow down to this other god, Mot, M-O-T, who was the death god. So when the rain would go away, the belief was, well, he's under the submission of Mot at this point. But God comes into this whole area and says, "Look, I control it all, and I control it all while I'm alive." So once again, it's just a powerful, if you think back to the 10 plagues, this is very similar to the 10 plagues, where God goes after exactly what the people believed and what they were worshiping and everything else, and he just destroys it. He just destroys it and leaves them with no other option. And so much to the point where they're willing to listen to Elijah afterwards, says, "Go find these prophets and do what? Take them out." So they're all killed. And that's why Jezebel's upset at the later date here. So then the warning is given. And then we look at Elijah. It says, "Then he was afraid, and he arose, and he ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he might die, saying, 'It is enough now, Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" So he's kind of given up. He just witnessed one of the most spectacular events of God's power, taking out all these false prophets in the way that it was done. And just one little threat from Jezebel, and all of a sudden he's afraid, and he's just ready to lay down and give up. So the angel of the Lord comes over and touches him and says, "Rise and eat, you've got a journey to go on." Now we know he's not here by God's will because of verse 9. God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here?" Elijah's response, he said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets and the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." He's the only one doing right. He's out there by himself. The 100 prophets are nothing. Obadiah's nothing. It's just him. Him against the world. And he's sad about it. So sad that he's ready to give up. So this whole thing plays itself out again. And if you remember, God says, walk out of this cave and see me. Well, he didn't. But what happened was there was a mighty wind. And then there was a mighty fire. And there was a mighty earthquake. And finally there was what? A still small voice. God. Elijah comes out with his face covered. And God says once again, what are you doing? And he tells him the whole thing all over again. I, even I only. And what's God say? We're down, let's see. Thanks, Monty. I apologize for not bringing the glasses today. Yeah. It says, the Lord said to him, go return your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu son of Nimshah you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat, and Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophets in your place, and the one who escapes from the sword, on and on and on. But basically what he says was there's going to be a whole new religious and political order, and you're going to be in charge of doing it. And if you read on, he doesn't do a lot of it. Elisha ends up doing some of this stuff. But look at verse 18. That's the most important one. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. We've got 7,000 more people we have to account for that we don't know about, that there's nothing being said about what they're doing. What's our lesson here? What's our lesson in today? You know, we see all this stuff going on in the world, and we're thinking, what's going on? I'm worried about this, and I'm worried about this, and I'm worried about this. God's got his people who we should be and ought to be and need to strive to be. But what a powerful message. All this time, God says, I'm going to leave 7,000 here that haven't even knelt to bow or kissed him. Not even mentioned before. So once again, I don't know what they were doing. If I'd have lived back then, I'd have said, look at those 7,000 scoundrels. They're not doing what I think they should do. They're certainly not doing what I'm doing, so how good can they be, kind of a deal. So it's just a good reminder to us as to what we've got. So what a powerful message here. And you can be sure that in times of crisis, people of faith will do what? They will all respond the same way. No, they won't. We don't see it in Scripture. And we don't see God condemning those that don't have this tight line we walk on how we see this and how we view this. So who's right? Is Ahab right? No, we know he's not right. But what about Elijah? Elijah right? He's doing what God told him? He's right. Obadiah? Certainly saved 100 prophets, right? 100 prophets? Stay alive. Hoo. And then the 7,000, right? So in times of crisis, people of faith will react differently. We need to be aware of that. We need to be sensitive to that. Yes, Monty.
There's a comment I wrote from a previous lesson. If you look at verses 11 through 13, where God says, I'm going to pass by, and he goes and looks for him. And you would think, boy, he's in that mighty wind, or he's in those other, and he's there in a whisper. But the person who talked about this before said, God was there. God was there even though Elijah didn't see him.
Yeah.
And that's true in our lives.
Yeah.
God is with us. We may not realize it, we may not understand it, we may not get it, but he's with us.
And once again, God continues to work with this guy that he said, step out of the cave, and he stays back, and the wind goes by, and the fire goes by, and the earthquake occurs. And then he hears the soft voice, and he steps out, but he's still got his face covered. But you're right, he didn't, and that's perfect. His face covered, he did not see God, but he heard him. And he did what he was told to do, for the most part. And just like the rest of us, he had weaknesses, and we fail. But in times of crisis, people are going to react differently, even people of good faith. So let's keep that in mind. So we're closing in on time here. Any comments? Steve?
Your last reminds me of when Jesus and Peter are walking, and Jesus tells Peter, hey, Satan's asked to sift you like wheat, and it's going to be bad going forward, but, when you're restored, encourage the others. And he turns around and he's like, well, what about him? And he's pointing to John. And Jesus is like, don't worry about him.
Don't worry about you.
And so I think sometimes I think it kind of ties in with this message. Like, God has different roles for different people, and as long as they're being faithful to God and what He's telling them to do, we got to be careful not to compare ourselves.
And one of the wisest guys I know, well, he was funny too, is Brother Paul Brown, elder here from years back. And I can remember repeatedly him giving people advice when they would say, I wish I could be here more with the kids. He said, look, there's a time in your life when you need to be doing this as God's servant. And then there'll be a time in your life when you can do what you want to be doing now as God's servant, but you're needed here, right? So not only do we not want to worry about what others are doing, obviously there's a thin line here. If someone's sinning, if someone's falling away, those kind of things, that's different. We're talking about people of faith that just react differently, all right? But there's a season in your life as well. Tomek, did you have a comment? Did you have your hand up? Okay. All right, so just a powerful lesson here. And then, like I said, we go on. Let's just look at this one. If I can get, look at that, it worked. So I think we've gone through all these. The interesting thing is this weaving in and out of the prophets. Like I said, he kind of disappears from the scene after this event. And then you see Micaiah come out, and he's the one that prophesies to Ahab and Jehoshaphat saying, sure, go to war. Because all the false prophets had said, yeah, go. You'll take them. And he comes in, and Jehoshaphat says, is there, I think he was a little suspicious. He says, isn't there yet another prophet of God that we can consult? And that's when Micaiah shows up. And Micaiah says, initially, sarcastically, yeah, go on. It's all yours. What's Ahab said? I knew you'd lie to me. So he knew. He knew the message. He knew what the truth was, but he refused to deny it. And but that comes in the midst right after this encounter where he says, even I, only I. So I think God is showing both him and showing us that we are not the only people. We're just not all that. We'd like to think we're that, but we're just not all that. So anyway, we'll close with this. We're not going to talk about Elisha next week. We're actually going to go to King Josiah, and I'll teach again next week because we got the schedule a little out of kilter last week. What's really neat about Elisha is when it was time for Elijah to go, Elijah asked Elisha, is there anything I can do for you? And now Elijah has lived with Elijah, and he's seen all the things he's done. What does he ask for? He asks for a double portion. Right? Now, a double portion of his faith, double portion of his spirituality, a double portion of his woes. Yeah, he saw Elijah go through a lot, right? He was tormented and all that. But he asked for a double portion. How much of us want that double portion? So you can go ahead and read about Elisha and the things he did, some very interesting things as well. But, yes?
I'd like to speak defense of the 100 prophets who were invited.
I didn't categorize them as not.
Well, you're saying voodoo and that kind of thing, and I'm thinking there are people now who have to go underground for their faith, and they're staying alive, and they can share their faith. So.
Well, that's what I thought I said, Judy. If I put that out differently, I didn't mean to. I was saying that these 100 prophets are just as important to God and doing a service just like Elijah, right? Just like Obadiah. Yeah. If I conveyed that, I conveyed it incorrectly. That was not the intent. Okay, well, that was our bell. Any questions, comments? All right, very good. Well, thanks for coming. And next week we'll talk about King Josiah. You may want to go read about him because I think we're going to find out again.